Building and deploying your first serverless .NET API using AWS Lambda and Amazon API Gateway. Hello everyone, my name is Ankush Jain and welcome to the second video of this series. In this video, you are going to learn how you can create an ASP.NET Core API in Visual Studio from scratch. Then you will configure the API to run inside a Lambda function. Then we will deploy it to AWS Lambda function using AWS Toolkit for Visual Studio. Finally, we will create an Amazon API Gateway instance, then create a route there and we'll connect that route with that Lambda function. In the end, we will test this API using ThunderClient, which is in Visual Studio Code extension to test REST APIs. So without any further delay, let's get started. So we have couple of steps that we have already mentioned on this page, and we are going to walk through those steps. So what is the first step? So first we need to create an ASP.NET Core API and then have to configure it to work as a Lambda function. So you just need to click here. So I will just click here and I just need to follow the instructions on the README files. So this file is basically located. Uh, okay, let me show you here one more thing. So the API that right now we are going to build is this one. Out of these four, which are ASP.NET Core APIs, so we are just first creating anonymous example API which do not require cognito authentication, and we will deploy this API on this Lambda function and will access it via REST API. So that's the one thing. Second thing, where this code you can find. So if you just want to see the code inside SRC, inside ASP.NET Core APIs, inside anonymous example, you can find the entire code for this API or this ASP.NET Core API application that we are going to create now. We will create it from scratch, but I have already created it here. We will just follow the steps that we have provided that I have provided here. So it's very easy to create such project which is already there in GitHub. So I will just come back to this link which where I came from this link. So this is the link, and now I will open Visual Studio and will follow the first step. So this says create a new application using ASP.NET Core Web API template. So I will just go to Visual Studio, will click File, New Project, and we'll select ASP.NET Core Web API. This is here. If it is not there, then you can just search. Then here I will just provide it a name, ASP.NET Anonymous example. Ah, fine. And let me change the solution name. So net.net net serverless APIs. Okay, this is the solution name, this is the project name, and let me click next. So framework is .NET 6, authentication is none, configure for HTTPS, use controllers, we are not using minimal APIs. So leaving everything as default, clicking on create button. This will create a new project. Yeah, so this is a brand new application has been created, and this is a traditional way of creating .NET Core API. So now we will proceed to the next step. Install this NuGet package, ASP, Amazon.lambda.ASP.NET Core server.hosting. So what does this package do? This package is basically configure your application ASP.NET Core API uh, to run in, it makes this application Lambda compatible. So it configure the application in a way so that this application can be run inside Lambda function. Just press OK, just press I accept, and I think this NuGet package is installed. Yeah, this is installed. Okay, so I will just close it and will close. Okay, I will save it. I will just try to build. It is building successfully, I guess. Okay, it is building successfully. Now moving to the next step, just add this line. So builder dot services dot, just copy this line and paste it inside program.cs before we are calling builder.build. Okay, so what does it do? It basically adds a Lambda support in your application, and you can see here we are using REST API Lambda event source because we are using Amazon API Gateway REST API. If we were using Amazon API Gateway HTTP API, then we would have to change it to HTTP API. But since we are not using that, we are going to we are good with REST API. Okay, so now everything is good, but I just want to show you one thing. I would like to cover one thing. What does this package do? So as I said, we will understand why we added this package and how does it convert or configure this application to run inside a Lambda function. So now first come to this point, which is the second point, how understand how the .NET Lambda function works, and then we will proceed with the further steps, step 4 and step 5. So okay, so in this step I am going to cover how the .NET Lambda functions works actually. What are the internals of .NET Lambda functions? So there are two types of .NET Lambda function. First one is a class library, which is not a web application. That is not an ASP.NET Core application. So we normally run those functions inside Lambda. Second is ASP.NET Core application, which is a web application that has controllers, that has actions. Okay, so initially when Lambda functions were launched, there were no ASP.NET Core support, but at later point of time that the ASP.NET Core support was added. So these were non ASP.NET Core Lambda functions were there, which we also call class library Lambda functions. So just click on this link and you will land on this AWS documentation for AWS for Lambda function handler in C Sharp. Just click on class library handler. So this is the typical handler or this typical Lambda function in .NET. There we have a class which is named as function. It could be a class name could be anything. Then we have this function handler, which is our method. So whenever a Lambda function gets a request, it will basically execute the business logic inside this function handler and will return the response which we are returning from here. So this is how .NET Lambda functions were supposed to work, and they work in, this is how they work. But how does Lambda function invoke this method? So for that, you must know what is the function handler. So when we deploy a Lambda function, when we create a Lambda function, we also provide a handler, and that something look like this. So that is basically an assembly. This is a signature. So first comes assembly, then there is a type, which is basically type of class, and then there is a method. So what happens uh, when this Lambda functions gets a request? So Lambda runtime will load the assembly with this name. So it loads the assembly in memory and uses reflection to identify type and invoke the method using reflection. So AWS Lambda runtime makes use of reflection to invoke this method, and then after execution, the response is returned to the client. So this is how a typical Lambda functions work, where we have a class, where we have a function, and the functions gets executed. Now coming to the second part, ASP.NET Core Lambda function. They are different. How they are different? In ASP.NET Core, we don't have a simple class and a simple function, because we have multiple endpoints. We create controllers, we define actions, and we there are routings, attribute based routing, and different kind of routing. So all those controller and action has different endpoints, and they needs to be executed. So that is entirely different concept than this class library handlers. So how do they work? So for that, the reason that's the reason we added this NuGet package here. So in program.cs, we added this line, and for that we added this add amazon.lambda.ASP.NET Core server.hosting NuGet package. Okay, so what does this NuGet package do? To understand that, I will take you to this link. I will just close the previous one. We'll scroll down to bottom. Okay, here ASP.NET Core. minimal APIs, and this is the line. So I will just read. I have just copied this line from here and I have pasted it here. So I'm reading it out, and it would be helpful to understand. So when the ASP.NET Core project is run locally, this line which we have added does nothing, allowing the normal .NET Kestrel web server to handle the local experience. Okay, so in when you run it locally, it runs the way it used to run with .NET Kestrel server. But when running in Lambda, AWS Lambda hosting swaps out Kestrel with Amazon.lambda.ASP.NET Core server, allowing Lambda and API gateway to act as a web server instead of Kestrel. So what happens when this ASP.NET Core API is run inside Lambda function? So at that moment, your Kestrel server is not basically getting the request and forwarding it to ASP.NET Core. Instead, this server will be basically getting the request from API gateway and will be forwarding the request to the uh, backend assembly of or ASP.NET Core application assembly. So that's how that's why we added that NuGet package, and you can just read out this blog. This is fantastic blog. And second thing, I will again take you to this link. So what happens, which I was talking. So this is the typical workflow where we client submits the request from his machine. The request come to IaaS or Nginx web servers, where we get entire web request that includes headers, query strings, and other payloads. Uh, then IaaS or Nginx as a reverse proxy forwards the request to Kestrel server. Kestrel server now has entire request in any format, maybe JSON or XML, I don't know, but that has everything in every information like headers, query string parameters, request body, request URL, and other information which needs to be there in web request. Now the Kestrel knows everything about web request. It passes the request to ASP.NET Core hosting, and ASP.NET Core is a framework, so it identifies the part what is controller, what is action, and accordingly it the assembly executes the requested part. It executes the action or or any controller, so all that kind of responsibilities on ASP.NET Core. So we are not going there how ASP.NET Core executes the request. But now once the request is executed by ASP.NET Core framework, then the request is sent, the response is sent to Kestrel. Kestrel sent the response to IaaS, and the response is sent to the client. This is the typical workflow. How it is replaced in Lambda? So in Lambda function, what happens? This Kestrel has been replaced by this Lambda, and IaaS is replaced by API gateway. So the client submits the request. Request comes to API gateway. API gateway sends the request to Lambda function. Now Lambda function has received the request. It has, so what API gateway does, there is a specific format. When a request comes from internet, API gateway has a specific format in which it sends the request to the Lambda function. So now the Lambda function has received the request in a specific format. So it has to understand that request because that has all the information like the similar headers, query strings, and body, but has a different format. So what it does, it understand those things and convert them in a format which ASP.NET Core require and forward it to ASP.NET Core framework. Now ASP.NET Core framework again process the response and process the request, return the response, and Lambda then further return the response to API gateway, and the response is sent to the client. So now the difference is Kestrel is replaced with Lambda. So now you might be asking, Kestrel is a web server, default web server which comes with .NET. So how this Lambda, Lambda server is handling the request? So with here, now I will take you to more links which are Lambda server and Kestrel server. So we'll basically understand what this Lambda here is. So you see, this is ASP.NET Core, .NET, .NET repository, which is managed by Microsoft. Here we have Kestrel server, and this Kestrel server is nothing just an implementation of iServer, and they have written entire code here. and they provided this server a name Kestrel. This is the default server that is being used by .NET Core, but .NET Core allows that anyone can create an implementation of iServer, and that's what AWS did. AWS created their own server, Lambda server, which is also an implementation of iServer. Now they are not using Kestrel server because they can't understand the request coming from the Kestrel can't understand the request that is coming from API gateway. So that's why they had to create Lambda server. Now Lambda understand there is because AWS has created, they understand the format that API gateway is sending. They are understanding the format and forwarding the request to ASP.NET Core framework, and then framework is executing the request and the flow is working like that. So these are the internals of how an ASP.NET Core application is processed uh, by Lambda functions in AWS. So I just wanted to uh, make you this thing understand so that because we are installing this NuGet package which we just installed. Where it is inside installed, yeah. So Amazon Lambda ASP.NET Core hosting. We will use this NuGet package heavily in further videos because we need to deploy this ASP.NET Core application in Lambda. And I wanted you to understand what is the internal, how does it work. So that's why I just covered this part. Okay, since we have covered this part, we will move ahead. We will move ahead. I will close this. I will close this. I will close this and this as well. Now we will move to this fourth step. I will just copy this. Again, I'm saying optionally add the following line if API is exposed to a child route. Since we are deploying multiple applications on a different routes, so that's why we are using child routes. Otherwise, you don't need to add this line. So I will just go to program.cs after. Okay. So now we will run this application from this prefix or this base path in API gateway. We are using app.use routing again. However, we would not require this if we would not have used this, because what happens, this has been internally called before this line. Since we are using again a different base path, that's why we had to call it again. Otherwise, this base path will not be considered. So that's again one more thing to remember. Now we are done. Last thing, just copy this thing from here and okay. So when I right click on this, you see two options: publish to AWS, publish to Elastic Beanstalk. But you are not getting an option publish to AWS Lambda. So that is one thing that I figured out. If I add this, you will start getting see this option publish to AWS Lambda. So you have to do it if you want to deploy this application from Visual Studio. Visual Studio. And how does it happen? Because we have installed AWS Toolkit here. Okay, AWS Toolkit for Visual Studio. That's why Visual Studio is able to understand uh, these texts. Okay, so now we have done that, and I think we can proceed to the next step. Okay, so now we are done with our coding part. We have created this application. The next thing is to deploy it on Lambda function. So what are the next steps? Create a Lambda function IAM role. Okay, so we'll go in IAM inside roles. So I have already created an IAM role for Lambda function. So let me see net. Yeah, this one hour ago I have created serverless.NET API Lambda function. So I just attached one managed policy here, AWS Lambda basic execution role, which is a AWS managed policy, and that basically provides permission to write logs in CloudWatch. So that we have already created. Now moving to the next step, create a Lambda function in AWS. So now I will just go to the Lambda function and we'll go here. We are using everything in North Virginia because in Mumbai region I have deployed the solution using CDK. So just don't want to uh, confuse you because everything will be on the same region. Okay, so now provide this a name. So what I will do, I will just copy this from here and will paste it here. In runtime, I will select .NET C Sharp, and in execution role, I will use an existing execution role. So what was that? I forgot the name. I guess .NET Serverless or .NET. Mm, .NET Serverless. What was that? Yeah, Serverless .NET API Lambda function. So this is the existing role, and don't need to touch advanced setting. Just create the function. So now function is created. We'll move to the next step. Deploy the ASP.NET Core Web API from Visual Studio. So now we will go to the Visual Studio. Okay, we can just see that function is created 14 seconds ago. Okay, now I will just right click on this, publish to AWS Lambda, and we'll select North Virginia region .NET 6. It will identify the function ASP.NET anonymous example. Configuration is release framework .NET 6. Now replace this with the assembly name. So which is this? Because this is ASP.NET Core .NET 6 application, and .NET 6 uses minimal API, and if you're using minimal API, you have to use assembly name. That again you can read why I am using this on this link. They have provided the reason why you need to use assembly name instead of assembly name, then type, then the method name. So I just kept the same as application name, then next. Okay, meanwhile we see what is the next step. After that, we need to create an API gateway and configure the routes. Okay, we are on the second page. So here the role is selected. Memory is 512 MB. No environment variables needed. So I will just click on upload button, and this will basically publish the application, will create a zip file and then upload it to Lambda function. So you can see the logs here. It is zipping and then created a publish archive, and finally it will upload the file. Okay, so the deployment is done. So here I will come back. It is 1 minute ago. Now I will just replace it is 9 seconds ago. So the latest deployment has been done. Okay, so we have created the Lambda function. We have deployed the .NET Core application there. Now we will move to create an API gateway and configure route. So I will just go here, API gateway, and here I will select. There are three APIs. So basically, HTTP API, WebSocket API, and REST API. And REST API private. We are going to select REST API, and here you need to select a new API. Don't select example API or any other API name. So again, I will .NET Serverless API. There are multiple options in endpoints: regional, edge, optimized, private. Just go with the regional one. Now we are here and we are using new console. Uh, so just click here. Now create resource, and here just type ASP.NET, because ASP.NET, because if I take you to the root of this page, we are following these routes: ASP.NET, then anonymous example. Okay, so first create a route with the ASP.NET, and then click on create resource. Resource and routes both are the same thing. Then again create a resource, uh, anonymous example. Okay, so we have created a route like ASP.NET slash anonymous example. Now what you need to do, you just need to click on anonymous example and again create one more resource, and this time you just need to tick this proxy resource. And what does this mean? Okay, so to understand this, I will just open a new file, notepad. So as of now our route, I will bring it here. As of now our route is this ASP.NET and anonymous example. Okay, so if I don't select it, any request if I don't select it and connect it with a backend Lambda function, so what will happen? Any request that is sent to this route will go to our Lambda function or ASP.NET Core API. But what if I want, and definitely I want that my request which are coming to this here, my controller name will come, then my action name will come. Okay, so if I use any a specific route, then I if I have used API as a prefix, so I want that any request coming to this or any request coming to this or any request which is coming to this, because this is something which my ASP.NET Core application will resolve. If there is a route, then that will return, that will execute. If there is no route, then it will return 404 from there. So I want that, I want to execute these child routes as well. So in order to do that, I have to enable it. Otherwise, it will not send those proxy those requests for the request to my backend Lambda function. And for that, I just will use proxy here. Proxy plus this is a fixed line. I mean, you have to use it in this format. I'm using it the way AWS suggests. And just click on create resource. Now you have created a resource and you have done everything. Just click on this method any, which will basically mm, accept any method, be it get, post, delete, anything. As of now, we have not configured the backend where the request should go when it comes to the API gateway. So we will add the integration. So I will select Lambda function here. So we may select HTTP, we may select AWS service, mock API, but the most common use case is Lambda function. So I will select this Lambda function. Here I will select Lambda proxy integration. Reason being, if I don't select it, it will just send the body to the backend. But if I select it, it means that uh, as I said, the API gateway will receive headers, query strings, body, everything, URL parameters and everything that a web request needs. So all those things needs to be sent to the Lambda function backend, so that the Lambda function can get will have the information, what is header, what is query string, and will execute the request accordingly. If I don't do it, it will not work. I mean, our ASP.NET Core API will not work in the backend. So I have to use Lambda proxy integration. And this proxy integration is different from proxy resource. So we are using both proxy resource plus proxy integration. Now I will select the Lambda function. This is anonymous, ASP.NET anonymous example. It is asking that API gateway need permission to invoke the Lambda function. So it will ask us and we will give the permission. Then click on save, or maybe it won't ask us, it will internally give the permission. So I will close all the notification and I will just deploy this API, because this API will not work until we publish it. So we will create a new stage. So new stage, I will provide this stage name dev, or let's say prod, or let's say dev. Yeah, dev is fine. Deploy it. Okay, let's see what are the next step. Okay, so we have created the API, configured the routes and deployed it on dev environment. So we'll copy the URL from here and I will come to the ThunderClient, because that was our last step, test from ThunderClient. So whether this API is working or not. So as of now, I will just, I had previously tested another API. So now that is URL is not working. So I will just go in my environments. I will update the new API gateway base URL. Okay. Rest things I don't need to change, and that we are not using. We are not using Cognito as of now, so we don't need to touch them. I just updated API gateway base URL, and I will go to collection anonymous example. This is our API ASP.NET. This is our prefix, and then later we are using weather forecast, which is basically pointing to our weather forecast controller. So now I will just execute this. I will click on send, and oh, missing authentication token. What we have forgot. This is anonymous example. Spinot core. Okay, let me think. I just troubleshooted this issue and this was a minor typo. So we are using wrong spelling. So here we has anonymous and here we has we had different spelling. So I will just go here. I don't think I can change the spelling. I will have to recreate it, but let's see. It won't work, so we'll have to do it again. So I'm just pausing my video and correcting all this configuration. Then we will test it again. So now I have made the changes and I have updated the spelling, and now this is anonymous example, and I have also deployed the new changes on the stage dev stage here. Okay, this is taking some time to appear. So now what we can do, we can just go here in our Thunder client and we can just hit the send button. So let me do the testing, and once I submit the send button, uh, it submits the request. And I think there's some issue with my internet, but yeah, it is working. And let me check it again. Could not resolve. So let me send it. Yeah, so now that was some intermittent issue of the internet, but now it is working, and you can see the stage is also there and we can invoke this URL. So this is how you have created a new ASP.NET Core application. You configured it to run as a Lambda function. You understood the internals, how does a .NET Lambda function works both in class library manner and both as an ASP.NET Core web application. So and then you created API gateway, you created routes, and then you deploy the API gateway on a stage, and finally you tested. So you we have covered this part, which was the first part, anonymous example. In the next lecture, we will first understand what is Amazon Cognito and what is Amazon Cognito user pool. Then we will move to the next part, which is how we can create an API and secure it with Amazon Cognito. So only this part was the anonymous example. Rest all the examples will make use of Amazon Cognito security. So I hope you have liked this video, and I will see you in the next video.